Maybe he isn't following you, the old fisherman would later say. Maybe he's trying to lead you somewhere. But on that cold October morning, Ethan Walker had no reason to believe that. The sky above Bar Harbor, Maine, hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. A salty wind drifted in from Frenchman Bay, carrying the scent of seaweed, wet wood, and distant lobster boats returning to the harbor. Ethan stepped out of the small grocery store with a paper bag tucked beneath one arm and his jacket collar turned against the chill. At 39, he still carried the posture of a Navy SEAL. Tall, broad-shouldered, quietly alert. His short brown hair showed the first hints of gray near the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent watching horizons most people never noticed. Since leaving the military 3 years earlier, Ethan had settled into a life of routine. He lived alone in a weathered cedar house overlooking the water. He fixed boats when neighbors needed help. He drank black coffee every morning on the same porch. And he avoided talking about the past whenever possible. The parking lot was nearly empty when he noticed the puppy. A small German Shepherd sat near a rusted newspaper box at the edge of the sidewalk. Its sable coat was damp from the mist rolling in off the bay. One ear stood upright while the other leaned slightly to the side. The puppy looked no older than 5 months. Thin, but not starving. Dirty, but not neglected. It simply sat there watching him. Ethan slowed his pace. The puppy did not move. "You got somebody waiting for you," he muttered. The dog tilted its head. Ethan glanced around the parking lot. No owner. No leash. No collar. Nothing. He sighed and continued toward his truck. The puppy remained where it was. 5 minutes later, Ethan parked outside his house. He grabbed his groceries and started toward the porch. Then he heard it. The soft patter of paws on wet gravel. He turned. The puppy stood near the mailbox. Watching him again, Ethan frowned. No, he pointed toward the road. Go home. The dog blinked. Ethan entered the house and shut the door. Problem solved. At least that's what he thought. Rain arrived shortly after sunset. Not a storm, just a steady coastal drizzle tapping softly against the windows. Ethan spent the evening repairing an old tackle box at the kitchen table while a baseball game murmured from the television. Around 9 o'clock, he walked to the front door to lock it. Something made him glance through the glass. The puppy was there, curled beside the porch steps. Wet, silent, waiting. Ethan stared for several seconds. The dog lifted its head, but made no sound. No whining, no scratching. Just those amber eyes reflecting the porch light. Ethan shook his head. Stubborn little thing. He left an old towel beneath the porch roof and returned inside. By morning, the rain had stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, turning the bay silver. Ethan stepped outside, holding a steaming mug of coffee. The towel remained exactly where he had left it. The puppy sat on top of it, awake, watching him, as if it had been waiting all night. And when Ethan took his first step toward the driveway, the puppy quietly stood and followed. By the third day, people had started noticing. Not Ethan. He tried not to. But in a town as small as Bar Harbor, Maine, unusual things rarely stayed unnoticed for long. The morning air carried the scent of pine, salt water, and fresh bread drifting from the bakery on Main Street. Ethan parked his truck beside the harbor and stepped out with a toolbox in one hand. Fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings while gulls circled overhead, calling into the pale blue sky. The puppy appeared less than a minute later. Ethan did not see where it came from. One moment the dock was empty. The next, small paws clicked softly across the weathered planks behind him. He stopped walking. The puppy stopped too. Ethan turned slowly. The German Shepherd sat down immediately. Watching. Waiting. You again. The dog tilted its head. Ethan looked around for an owner. There was none. You know this is getting strange, right? The puppy offered no answer except a slow wag of its tail. Ethan sighed and continued toward the marina workshop. Throughout the morning, he repaired a damaged winch on a lobster boat owned by a retired fisherman named Frank Delaney. The work kept his hands busy, which was usually enough to keep his thoughts quiet. But every time he glanced toward the dock, the puppy was there. Not begging, not barking, just sitting nearby as if standing watch. Around noon, Frank noticed it too. The old fisherman wiped grease from his hands and nodded toward the dog. Friend of yours? Ethan looked up from his tools. No, Frank chuckled. Looks like nobody told him that. Ethan shook his head. I have never seen him before this week. Frank studied the puppy for a moment. Funny thing. Most strays follow food. Ethan returned to his work. And this one? The old man smiled faintly. Looks like he is following something else. Ethan pretended not to hear him. By late afternoon, clouds rolled across the bay again. A cold breeze swept through the harbor, rattling ropes against metal masts. Ethan stopped at a small coffee shop before heading home. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Warm air scented with cinnamon and roasted coffee beans wrapped around him. He ordered the same thing he always ordered. Black coffee. Nothing else. When he sat beside the window, he noticed movement outside. The puppy had settled beneath a nearby bench. Rain had started again. Tiny droplets darkened its fur. Ethan stared through the glass. The dog stared back. Something about that look unsettled him. It was not desperation, not fear. It was patience. The kind of patience people carried when they believed they could wait forever. That evening, Ethan drove home through winding coastal roads lined with pine trees and granite cliffs. The headlights swept across wet pavement, shining silver beneath the rain. Halfway home, he glanced into the rearview mirror. For a brief second, he thought he saw the puppy standing beside the road, watching his truck disappear into the darkness. When he reached home, he tried to shake the feeling. He cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, read half a chapter of an old novel. Yet sometime after midnight, he found himself standing at the front window. Outside, moonlight drifted between moving clouds. The yard appeared empty. The porch was empty too. For the first time. All week, the puppy was gone. Ethan should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something else. Something he could not explain. Then, far beyond the edge of his property, near the dark tree line overlooking the bay, he saw a small silhouette standing perfectly still, watching the house from a distance. And when a cloud uncovered the moon, Ethan realized the puppy was not looking at him. It was looking toward the forest behind his home. The next morning, Ethan told himself he was imagining things. People saw patterns when they were lonely. That was all. The sun rose pale over Frenchman Bay, spreading a thin ribbon of gold across the water. Fishing boats were already moving through the harbor, their engines humming softly against the stillness of dawn. Ethan stood on his porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. The forest behind his property looked ordinary again. Pine trees, granite outcroppings, narrow trails disappearing into shadow. No sign of the puppy, no sign of anything unusual, yet the feeling remained. He could not explain it. Around 8 o'clock, he grabbed his truck keys and headed into town. Halfway down the gravel driveway, movement flashed between the trees. The puppy emerged from the woods and trotted calmly toward the road. Ethan stopped walking. The dog paused and looked back at him. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then the puppy turned and disappeared into the forest again. Ethan frowned. This time curiosity won. He left the truck where it was and followed. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding through tall pines that filled the air with the scent of sap and damp earth. Fallen needles softened his footsteps. Sunlight filtered through the branches in scattered beams that painted the forest floor gold and green. Every few yards, Ethan caught sight of the puppy ahead. Sometimes it stood waiting beside a moss-covered rock. Sometimes it appeared farther up the trail before vanishing again, always just far enough away to stay out of reach. "What are you doing?" Ethan muttered. The dog glanced back once more and continued deeper into the woods. Nearly half a mile from the house, the trail opened into a small clearing. Ethan stepped forward and stopped. The puppy was gone. The clearing sat silent beneath the trees. Wild grass swayed gently in the breeze. A weathered wooden bench rested beneath an old maple tree whose leaves had already begun turning shades of amber and crimson. There was nothing remarkable about the place, yet something felt familiar. Ethan slowly approached the bench. The wood was faded from years of rain and snow. Someone had carved initials into one corner long ago. He ran a hand across the surface. A strange heaviness settled over him. Not fear. Memory. The kind that arrives without invitation. For a moment he remembered another bench. Another quiet morning years earlier. A distant military base. A conversation he had spent years trying to forget. Ethan stepped back and shook the thought away. When he looked around again, the puppy was standing at the far edge of the clearing, watching him. "Is this what you wanted?" Ethan asked. The dog simply stared. Then its ears suddenly lifted. It turned toward something deeper in the woods. A second later it bolted away. Ethan followed instinctively. Branches brushed against his jacket as he moved between the trees. The puppy stayed ahead, weaving through the forest with surprising confidence. Then it disappeared once more. Ethan emerged onto another trail and stopped. A young girl stood about 30 yards away near a cluster of birch trees. She could not have been older than 9. She wore a faded blue jacket and carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Long brown hair moved gently in the breeze. The puppy stood beside her. Not excited, not playful, protective. The girl looked down at the dog and rested a hand lightly on its head. Then she lifted her eyes toward Ethan. Neither spoke. The forest seemed to grow quieter around them. For several long seconds, they simply stared at one another. Then the girl turned and began walking deeper into the trees. The puppy followed at her side. Before disappearing behind the pines, the dog looked back one last time, as if making certain Ethan had seen her. The image of the girl stayed with Ethan for the rest of the day. Not because she had spoken. She had not. Not because she had done anything unusual. She had simply stood there in the forest with the puppy beside her, as if both of them belonged to a story he had somehow wandered into without realizing it. That evening, fog rolled in from the bay and wrapped itself around the coastline like a gray blanket. The harbor lights glowed softly through the mist. Ethan sat alone on his porch, listening to distant buoys ringing somewhere beyond the darkness. His coffee had long gone cold. He kept thinking about the clearing, the bench, and the strange feeling that had settled over him the moment he arrived there. Around sunrise the next morning, he found the puppy sleeping beneath the porch again, curled tightly against the wooden steps. Ethan stared down at him for several seconds. The dog opened one eye, lifted its head, and thumped its tail once against the boards. "You really do not quit, do you?" Ethan said quietly. The puppy stood and stretched. Then, instead of following Ethan toward the driveway, it trotted toward the forest path. It stopped after 20 feet and looked back, waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly. Fine. The trail felt different in the morning light. Dew clung to spiderwebs stretched between ferns. Sunlight filtered through the pines in long golden shafts. The scent of damp earth and fallen leaves filled the air. The puppy led him deeper than before. Nearly 3/4 of a mile from the house, Ethan began noticing signs that someone spent time here regularly. A narrow footpath worn into the grass. A small stack of stones balanced beside a tree. Wildflowers arranged carefully near the base of an old stump. Someone had been coming here often. Eventually, the trees opened into another clearing, smaller than the first, hidden from the main trail. The girl was there. She sat cross-legged on a fallen log with a notebook resting in her lap. The puppy immediately trotted to her side. This time she did not walk away. Ethan stopped several yards back, careful not to startle her. The girl looked up. Her brown eyes were cautious but calm. "He belongs to you?" Ethan asked. She glanced at the puppy and gently scratched behind his ear. No, her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Ethan waited. "Then whose dog is he?" The girl lowered her gaze. "Nobody's." The answer surprised him. The puppy certainly acted like he belonged somewhere. Ethan stepped closer. "I am Ethan." The girl hesitated before answering. "Maggie." The wind stirred the maple leaves overhead. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan noticed the notebook in her lap. Its edges were worn, the cover faded by time and weather. Maggie instinctively pulled it closer against her chest. Not afraid. Protective. Ethan recognized the gesture. People only held things that way when they carried meaning. "You come out here every day?" he asked. Maggie nodded once. The puppy rested his head on her knee. "And he comes with you?" Another nod. Ethan looked between them. Something about the scene felt strangely important, as if the answer to a question he had not yet asked was sitting right in front of him. Then a folded piece of paper slipped from the notebook and fluttered onto the ground. Maggie's face changed instantly. She lunged forward to grab it. But Ethan had already seen the corner of a photograph attached to the page. A photograph showing a man in military uniform. The photograph flashed into view for only a second before Maggie pulled the paper back into the notebook. Yet that second was enough. Ethan had spent years around military uniforms. He recognized one immediately. The man in the picture looked to be in his early 30s. Strong jaw, calm eyes, a service dress uniform neatly pressed. There was something familiar about him, though Ethan could not place it. Maggie carefully tucked the photograph between the notebook pages and held it close. The puppy shifted beside her, resting one paw across her boot, as if guarding both her and the worn journal. The afternoon breeze moved softly through the trees overhead. Leaves drifted down around them like quiet pieces of autumn. Ethan kept his voice gentle. Someone in your family? Maggie looked down at the notebook. My dad. The answer came almost as a whisper. Ethan nodded. Was he in the Navy? Maggie shook her head. He was a corpsman. Ethan felt a small jolt of recognition. Navy corpsmen often worked alongside Marines and special operations units. Some of the finest people he had ever known had worn that title. He glanced again at the notebook. You come out here to read his letters? Maggie nodded. For several seconds, neither spoke. The forest seemed wrapped in a strange kind of stillness. Even the wind had quieted. Then Maggie carefully opened the notebook again. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Some pages looked newer. Others had yellowed with age. Folded between them were photographs, ticket stubs, pressed leaves, and small memories preserved like treasures. My mom gave it to me, Maggie said. She said he wrote things down whenever he was away. Ethan listened. Do you read it often? Every day. Her fingers brushed one page gently. It helps me remember him. The puppy lifted his head and looked toward Ethan. For the first time, Ethan noticed something attached beneath the thick fur around the dog's neck. A narrow strip of faded blue fabric. Barely visible. Almost hidden. It looked old. Weathered. Not a collar exactly. More like a piece of cloth someone had tied there long ago. Ethan leaned slightly forward. What is that around his neck? Maggie glanced down. I do not know. He came with it. She nodded. The first day I found him. Ethan studied the fabric. Something about it bothered him. Not in a bad way. In the way unfinished memories sometimes bothered people. Like a song you almost remembered. Like a name resting just beyond reach. The sun slowly dipped lower behind the trees. Golden light filtered through the branches and painted the clearing in warm amber colors. Maggie closed the notebook. I should go. Ethan stood. Do you live nearby? A little way from here. Does your mother know you come into the woods alone? A faint smile appeared. She knows. The puppy immediately rose to his feet as Maggie adjusted her backpack. Together they started toward the trail. After a few steps, Maggie stopped and looked back. He likes you. Ethan glanced at the dog. Really? Maggie nodded. He does not follow anyone else. Then she disappeared between the trees. The puppy followed beside her. But after 10 yards, he suddenly stopped. He turned around, trotted back toward Ethan, and gently dropped something at his feet. A folded piece of paper that had slipped unnoticed from the notebook. Across the top, written in faded ink, was a single name. Ethan froze the moment he read it. The world seemed to narrow around that single name. Ethan stood motionless in the fading light, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. Daniel Mercer. The letters were faded, written years ago in dark blue ink that had softened with time. Ethan stared at them as memories began rising from places he had spent years keeping locked away. The forest disappeared. The cool autumn air disappeared. For a moment, he was standing somewhere else entirely, beneath a different sky, hearing a familiar voice laugh at a joke he could no longer remember. Daniel Mercer. A Navy corpsman. Quiet. Steady. The kind of man who noticed when others were struggling and never made them feel embarrassed for it. Ethan had not spoken that name in nearly 10 years. He slowly unfolded the paper. It was only part of a letter. The edge looked torn, as if it had separated from a larger page long ago. The handwriting was neat and careful. There were only a few lines visible. To my little girl, if you are reading this someday, I hope you know that every mile I travel, I carry you with me. Ethan swallowed hard. The evening breeze stirred the pines overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a gull called across the bay. He looked toward the trail where Maggie and the puppy had disappeared. Suddenly, dozens of questions flooded his mind. Daniel had a daughter? How had Ethan never known? Why was Maggie carrying these letters? And why had that puppy brought this page to him? The dog could not possibly understand what was written on it. Yet somehow it had chosen this exact piece of paper. Ethan carefully folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He followed the trail for several minutes, hoping to catch sight of Maggie again, but the forest had already swallowed her path. By the time he returned home, darkness had settled over the coastline. Waves rolled gently against the rocky shore below his property. The porch light cast a warm circle across the damp boards. Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with an old laptop he rarely used. He typed Daniel Mercer's name into a veteran's database. The search results appeared almost instantly. His chest tightened. There was the photograph, older than the one Maggie carried, but unmistakable. Daniel's calm eyes looked back at him from the screen. Beneath the image were service records, commendations, deployment histories. Ethan read each line slowly. Then he found something that made him freeze. One deployment location. 1 year. One operation. The exact mission Ethan himself had been assigned to nearly a decade earlier. He leaned back in his chair. Rain began tapping softly against the windows. Daniel had been there. Not somewhere nearby. Not attached to another unit. He had been part of the same operation. Ethan closed his eyes, searching his memory. Faces. Names. Long nights. Endless movement. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he could not remember meeting Daniel directly. The realization bothered him more than he expected. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Eventually, Ethan rose from the table and walked toward the front window. Outside, the yard lay quiet beneath moonlight. Then he saw him. The puppy sat near the edge of the property, just beyond the porch light, watching the house again, watching Ethan. And for the first time, Ethan found himself wondering if the dog had been trying to tell him something from the very beginning. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of low clouds drifting over the Atlantic. The air smelled of rain and salt, and the harbor seemed quieter than usual. Ethan barely touched his breakfast. The name Daniel Mercer lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished conversation. By 9 o'clock, he found himself walking the forest trail again. He told himself he was looking for answers. The truth was simpler. Something deep inside him needed to see Maggie. Needed to understand why a forgotten piece of his past had suddenly appeared on his doorstep wrapped in fur and 4 muddy paws. The trail wound through pines darkened by moisture. Drops of water clung to branches overhead and fell softly onto the carpet of needles below. As Ethan approached the clearing, he spotted the puppy first. The young German Shepherd stood near the old bench, ears alert, tail moving gently. The moment he saw Ethan, he trotted forward as though greeting an old friend. Ethan crouched and scratched behind one ear. The puppy leaned into the touch without hesitation. It was the first time he had allowed himself to do that. The first time he stopped treating the dog like a mystery and simply treated him like a dog. A few seconds later, Maggie appeared from the trees. She carried the notebook tucked beneath one arm. Her expression brightened slightly when she saw the puppy beside Ethan. "He likes you even more now," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "I think I am starting to like him too." They sat together on the old bench. For a while they simply listened to the wind moving through the forest. Maggie opened the notebook and carefully turned a few pages. Ethan noticed that many contained letters. Others held photographs. One picture showed Daniel standing beside a younger woman holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Maggie traced the photograph with her finger. "That was me," she said. Ethan nodded. "Your father looked proud." A small smile appeared. "Mom says he always was." The puppy rested at their feet, completely relaxed, completely content. Ethan watched Maggie turn another page. A folded letter slipped free. This time she did not hide it. Instead, she handed it to him. "You can read this one." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure?" Maggie nodded. "It talks about people he served with." Carefully, Ethan unfolded the page. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. The letter described long days away from home, friendships built through trust, and gratitude for the people who watched over one another when families were far away. Ethan read slowly. Then he reached a sentence that made his heart stop. "There is a man named Ethan Walker on this deployment. He probably does not realize it, but he carries more weight than anyone sees. Good men often do. If I ever meet my daughter again after this mission, I hope she grows up knowing people like him still exist in the world." Ethan stared at the words. His throat tightened. He read the sentence. Again, then again. Daniel had noticed him, remembered him, thought about him. Years ago, when Ethan himself could barely remember speaking more than a few words to the Corpsman. The forest blurred for a moment. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Maggie watched him with quiet concern. Neither noticed the puppy rise to his feet and press gently against Ethan's leg, as though he already knew exactly what those words meant. For a long time, Ethan could not speak. The letter rested in his hands while the forest around him seemed to fade into a distant hush of wind and leaves. He had spent years believing that most of what he carried had gone unseen. The long deployments, the quiet guilt, the memories he never shared. Yet somehow Daniel Mercer had seen through all of it. Not only seen it, understood it. Maggie watched him carefully. The puppy remained pressed against his leg, warm and steady. Ethan finally folded the letter and handed it back. "Your father was a good man," he said softly. Maggie smiled. "Everyone says that." Ethan looked toward the trees. "Sometimes people say things because they sound nice." He paused. "I am saying it because it is true." The afternoon drifted by slowly after that. Maggie showed him more pages from the notebook. Small stories. Simple memories. Notes Daniel had written about home. About teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle one day. About fishing on quiet lakes. About never missing a birthday if he could help it. None of the pages spoke about heroics. None spoke about hardship. They spoke about love. The kind that survives distance. The kind that keeps writing letters even when no one knows whether they will ever be read. As the sun lowered behind the trees, Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in years. The puppy seemed to notice. Every time Ethan laughed quietly at one of Daniel's stories, the dog's tail tapped happily against the ground. Eventually Maggie closed the notebook. "There is one letter I have never read," she said. Ethan looked up. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Mom told me to wait until I was ready." Slowly she reached into the back cover and removed an envelope sealed with age. The paper had yellowed slightly. Daniel's handwriting stretched across the front. "For Maggie. Someday." The sight alone tightened Ethan's chest. Maggie stared at it for several seconds. "I think I am ready now." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Together they sat beneath the old maple tree while evening light filtered through crimson leaves overhead. Maggie carefully opened the envelope. The puppy settled beside her feet. The forest grew quiet once more. She unfolded the letter and began reading silently. At first her expression remained calm. Then her eyes widened slightly. A few moments later tears gathered along her lashes. Ethan looked away respectfully, giving her space. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant seawater through the clearing. Somewhere beyond the trees, waves rolled against the rocky shore. Finally Maggie lowered the page. "He wrote about me," she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. "Of course he did." She shook her head. "Not just me." Her hand trembled as she turned the paper toward him. "He wrote about someone else too." Ethan accepted the letter carefully. His eyes moved down the page. Halfway through, his breath caught. Daniel had written about a future he hoped would happen if he never returned home. He wrote about faith, about kindness, about trusting good people. Then Ethan reached the final paragraph. There, written in the same steady handwriting, was a sentence that made his eyes fill with tears. "If my little girl ever finds herself alone, I hope someone good finds her before life grows too heavy. Someone strong enough to stay. Someone who understands what it means to carry others home." Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. And beside him, the puppy gently rested his head across Ethan's knee as if he had known all along where this journey was meant to lead. Autumn settled fully over Bar Harbor in the weeks that followed. The maple leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the cold Atlantic wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the rocky coastline. Some mornings began with fog drifting through the harbor. Others arrived bright and clear beneath endless blue skies. Yet for Ethan, something had changed. The house overlooking the bay no longer felt quite so empty. Maggie visited often after school. Sometimes they sat beneath the old maple tree in the clearing. Sometimes they walked along the shoreline collecting smooth stones polished by the tide. The puppy came everywhere with them. Before long, nobody called him a stray anymore. He had become part of something larger, part of a family that none of them had expected to find. One Saturday afternoon, Maggie arrived carrying the notebook beneath her arm. The puppy bounded ahead of her, racing up Ethan's porch steps before stopping proudly at the front door. Ethan laughed and opened it. "Looks like somebody thinks he owns the place." Maggie smiled. "I think he does." The dog hurried inside and immediately settled onto the same rug beside the fireplace where he always slept, as if he had been born there. Later that evening, the three of them sat outside watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The bay shimmered with ribbons of orange and gold. Fishing boats returned to harbor beneath clouds glowing softly in the fading light. Maggie opened the notebook one final time. Many of the pages had become familiar now. The stories, the letters, the dreams Daniel had written down years ago. She turned slowly to the very last page. Tucked inside was a small photograph Ethan had never seen before. Daniel stood smiling beside a younger version of himself. Both men wore uniforms. Both looked exhausted. Both looked happy. Ethan stared at the image and felt something inside him settle peacefully for the first time in years. Daniel had not disappeared from the world. His kindness remained. His love remained. His daughter remained. The life he hoped would continue had continued after all. Maggie carefully placed the photograph back into the notebook and closed it. The puppy rested his head across Ethan's boot. The evening air had grown cooler now. Somewhere across the bay, a lighthouse blinked steadily against the darkening sky. Maggie looked toward the water. "Do you think Dad would be happy?" Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon. For a moment he thought about the letters, the notebook, the forest, the puppy who had refused to stop following him. Then he smiled. "I think he already is." Maggie nodded quietly. Neither spoke again for several minutes. There was no need. The waves rolled gently against the shore below. The wind moved softly through the pines. Beside them, the young German shepherd closed his eyes and sighed contentedly, as if his work was finally done. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. Not long ago, he had believed the puppy was following him for a reason he could not understand. Now he finally knew the truth. The dog had never been searching for a home. He had been leading Ethan toward one. And beneath the fading colors of a Maine sunset, 3 lonely souls sat together overlooking the sea, no longer carrying their burdens alone, while somewhere beyond sight, a promise made years ago had quietly found its way home.